The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Julie Petty and I work with Meat and Livestock Australia as the goat industry project manager. Today's webinar, as you would have seen, is all about on-farm biosecurity and what you need to know to protect your livelihood. But before we get into that, I'll quickly just run through some admin stuff. So you'll notice when you log in that you'll have a couple of different options in terms of your audio settings and listening in with us today. So if you're having any dramas using your computer speakers or the audio is not coming through that clearly, feel free to dial in using your telephone with the phone number and access code that's appearing on your screen at the moment. You'll also find these numbers in the registration email you would have received when you registered for the webinar. I should mention that today's webinar is being recorded as well, so if you for some reason wanted to come back and watch this later or knew of someone who wasn't able to join us live today, don't stress. The webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the MLA website in the next couple of days. On your webinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen, you will notice there that there's a little red arrow at the top of the screen, which will allow you to expand or hide the webinar control panel there. So if it hides itself or anything like that, you can just click on that red arrow again. You'll also see there in the audio drop-down box, that's where you can change your audio settings between telephone and computer speakers. And I should mention also that if you have any questions for myself or our presenter today, at any point in time, you're welcome to type those in to the questions panel, which is also on your webinar control screen there. All those questions will come through to myself and I can ask those on your behalf. Just to limit background noise, we have got all of our attendees on mute. So, as I mentioned, today's webinar is all around on-farm biosecurity and what you need to know to protect your livelihood. Our guest speaker today is Emma Rooke from the Livestock Biosecurity Network, which is funded through the Sheep Meat Council, Cattle Council and Wool Producers Australia. The Livestock Biosecurity Network has been set up essentially to support producers in making sure that they are biosecure ready. And what we're going to cover in today's presentation is a bit of an overview of some of the impacts and flow-on effects if we were to have an outbreak of a pest or disease within Australia and how that would impact our industries and economy. We're also going to hear from Emma a bit of an overview about some of the tips and tools and information that is available to you as producers to help you in managing biosecurity and establishing a biosecurity plan for your farm. So Emma, without further ado, I'm just going to change the settings over to make you the presenter, and so everyone should be able to see your screen.
Thanks a lot, Julie. Can you hear me?
Yep.
And I should have the screen up there.
Excellent. Yep, that's coming through.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, hello everyone. My name is Emma Rooke. I work for Livestock Biosecurity Network, and this morning I just wanted to introduce you to LBN, talk to you a little bit about biosecurity and how it affects you. LBN was established in 2013 by the Grazing Industry Peak Industry Council, so sheep meat, wool producers and cattle councils, and it was in response to industry concerns about the impacts of pest and disease on livestock industries. The initiative is funded out of industry levies, and that's held in trust and aims to produce practical information for producers about implementing on-farm animal health, welfare and biosecurity measures to deal with the everyday risks that you face. So LBN has staff around Australia, and we're working with producers but also others in the supply chain to reduce the impact, particularly of endemic diseases on your business. But at the same time, there's an important role in increasing industry preparedness for possible emergency animal disease outbreaks. So we're not a government organisation, we're funded by industry, but we do work closely with other relevant organisations, including government, to provide opportunities for producers to learn more about what they can do on farm to improve your animal health, welfare and biosecurity, and be prepared in case of an emergency animal disease incursion. So with that intro, I'll just briefly go over what we sort of mean by biosecurity. Is it border control, or what we used to call quarantine? Or is it restrictions on the movement of products into and out of states or regions to protect regionally important industries? Or is it the management of pest, weed and disease risks to farming enterprises? Actually, biosecurity is all these things, and no matter whether it's the Australian border, a regional production or conservation area, or the farm gate, the principles of biosecurity are all the same. Biosecurity is about risk management, and it's about the protection of the economy, the environment and public health from the negative impacts associated with pests, disease and weeds. Biosecurity is about managing the risks of those things entering, establishing and spreading into or throughout an area. So that could include everything sort of from your farm right through to sort of the national level. So it's about keeping things out, keeping things in and minimising the impact. So probably most of you have seen some of these pictures before. This is foot and mouth disease in the UK in 2001. And foot and mouth is one of the contagious diseases, one of the most contagious diseases known to man. So just to put it into perspective, if Ebola was this contagious, half of us would probably be dead by now. But the reason FMD is so important to Australia isn't because it kills lots of animals. It's because of the massive impacts it has on production. And because of this, it could shut down markets overnight. As you know, Australia is the world's third largest exporter of beef, with combined red meat exports worth $8.7 billion a year and $10 billion if you include the live export trade. Now, we've all seen images of foot and mouth disease outbreak in the UK in 2001, and it doesn't take much imagination to think how devastating this outbreak would be for the national economy and for the communities affected. And this is in a country without such a strong export focus like Australia. So recent modelling done by the Department of Agriculture in Canberra shows that a small outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Australia, just affecting a single state, could cost approximately $100 million just in control costs and about $6 billion loss of revenue to the livestock industry. If you expand this out to a more likely scenario where in our current environment we'd probably see a multi-state outbreak, then you're looking at much larger control costs and revenue losses around about $52 billion if you're looking over a period of 10 years. And most of these impacts are based on reduction in the market price for our livestock products. So you can see that even for a small outbreak, that's the blue one on this graph, the beef prices are reduced by about 15% in the first year and then recover over a period of about 3 to 4 years to normal price. However, in a large outbreak, beef producers' beef prices are reduced by a massive 80%. So that's about 20% of the original price, and they only recover to about 80% of their original price even after 10 years. The reason we think this is what would happen is because in a large multi-state outbreak, Australia would be kicked out of the international market for over a year, and this means we'd lose our market as they look for someone else to supply their beef. So the disease would also stop exports from other products from ruminants, including lamb and mutton, goat meat, skins, and possibly even milk, wool and fibre. So that just gives a bit of an overview of the reason the impact would be so big on the livestock industry, particularly in Australia. But what none of these figures show is how devastating this disease can be for communities. I was in the UK at the time, and none of these images can really capture how horrific the impact was on these communities. Just as an example, children were sent away from home into town for schooling, so they didn't have to commute back and forth onto the farm, bringing risk of disease with them. I also met other people who hadn't left their properties for weeks and were having groceries delivered to the gate for fear of bringing disease home with them. On top of that, there was shutdown of rural tourism, which in the UK is a really big thing, people running B&Bs, particularly because of the footpath. And businesses as far removed as London were experiencing huge downturns in business because of the flow-on effect from lack of spending in the rural communities. So in Australia, 200,000 people work directly in the red meat sector alone, and that's not including communities, businesses that support these people. On top of that, economic and social impact, I experienced situations where herds and flocks were slaughtered, and those genetics are, sort of lost forever. And of course, on top of that, potential human health impact. So it really is a really big impact outside just the direct economic losses. So, what we learned from the UK and through other outbreaks of disease is that the difference between a small and an large outbreak, really comes down to time to detection and the speed of spread. So I'm not showing you these figures of foot and mouth to scare you, because of course they grab our attention, but these two activities are really critical to managing or detecting an outbreak in Australia. We saw this in equine influenza, where the disease remained undetected and unreported until after a number of horse shows where horses were coming together, mixing and then dispersing again. And subsequently we saw the disease was spread over much of New South Wales and southern Queensland before it was detected. Foot and mouth in the UK was spread from the north because of sick sheep coming into a sale yard, mixing with healthy sheep and then being distributed to almost every part of the country. We know that good biosecurity practices and early detection and reporting are the foundations of protecting Australia from devastating exotic diseases. But the reason I wanted to talk to you about that today is that the same practices can protect you from unwanted and costly endemic diseases, pests and weeds. So here are some conditions that impact productivity. I mean, most endemic diseases don't cause international trade impacts, but they're arguably much more important to Australia on a day-to-day basis. The impacts of endemic disease on livestock populations in Australia year on year are having significant impacts on productivity in all parts of Australia, and they can have domestic trade consequences as well. In fact, historically, some of these diseases have been highly regulated for this reason, with lice and footrot being important enough to bring about the establishment of agriculture departments and local extension services in many states. So how many of these diseases are a risk to your business? And how many are impacting you right now? And how would you know? These sheep could have any or all of these conditions. What sort of assurances did you ask for before you bought these sheep? What did you do with them when you brought them on farm? Did you mix them with existing stock? And yet all these diseases will impact you through lost productivity, cost of treatment, the time and effort required to treat, difficulty in eradicating, and then on a bigger picture, access to markets, potentially your reputation, and of course the well-being of you and your animals. So the point of biosecurity is really to be able to enable the safe movement of animals, people, equipment and other products onto and off your place, and also to be able to effectively respond to any pest and disease incursion that may occur. So I've just put together a few tips, and they're really linked back to how we can decrease the time of detection to disease and how we can reduce the speed of spread. And because as we know, these are the two key things that are the difference between a small and a large outbreak. So first of all, biosecurity planning is really about business risk management. What are some of the risks that impact your business and what are you most concerned about? It's good to know the diseases in your area, so their prevalence, their signs and how they spread. But if you're purchasing livestock from outside your local area, there's different risks that you need to think about. So knowing where your main sources of risks are coming from can help you prioritise and think about how you might manage these risks. So one way of limiting your sources of risk is to look at where you're buying your livestock. Risk is cumulative and is a function of the number of times you're exposed to that risk and the consequence if that risk is realised. So this graph shows that the number of lines of animals that are introduced, as the number of lines goes up, the probability of buying in disease also goes up. So, for example, for one line of disease, one line of animals purchased, the risk sits here for these 3 diseases. Whereas as you go up to 3 or 4 lines of animals introduced, the risk or the probability of buying in disease goes up significantly. So the consequence of acquiring any one of these diseases, and it doesn't actually matter whether it's lice, JD or footrot or some other disease, depends on the current status of your flock. So whether you've got the disease on your place already or not, and what your business model is. Are you trading lambs? Do you have a stud enterprise? Are you a wool or a meat producer? And basically the same principle as for this purchasing livestock can be applied to other activities you undertake on your farm. What is the risk and how and what is the consequence of doing that activity? So the second thing is that it's hard to detect if there's a problem if you don't know your flock or your herd. So it's really important to know your stock and to detect a problem early. The more quickly you can detect a problem, the quicker you can implement remedial actions and the less the overall impact will be on your enterprise. Weeds are a really good example of this, but the principle is the same for livestock disease. You need to know your animals and it's really important to investigate illness. So call your vet or your local animal health or vet officers if you notice anything unusual. In some enterprises, a change in health status will be easy to detect. So dairies find it easy to detect small changes in milk production or quality, whereas others, especially our grazing livestock enterprises, you need to have really good powers of observation, know what's normal for your animals and investigate quickly. Biosecurity SA in South Australia, but your departments of primary industries, animal health in your own state, probably offer subsidies for disease investigation. The funding is to encourage disease investigation so that we can talk to our trading partners and tell them we haven't got any of these nasty emergency animal diseases like foot and mouth, and that if we did have them, that we're out in the community and that we would pick it up. The fund's almost never fully subscribed, so it's worth asking the question if there's subsidies for disease investigation. On top of that, keep records of unusual clinical signs, behaviour, illnesses or deaths, and at the same time record management activities, treatment, feed purchase or any changes, and these records can be useful when looking for causes of illness in your herd and flock. Thirdly, it's really important to report anything out of the ordinary. So if the time to detection of an outbreak is you noticing a problem and the time it takes to report that problem, it's a key step between a small and a large outbreak. It's just not only for livestock disease, but also something highly weedy. And the sooner you can detect it and report it to someone who can help you, the better. So foot and mouth disease in the UK initially occurred in a piggery, And it's hard to imagine someone missing the signs of a pig with FMD. They get really sick, salivating, hobbling on their sore feet. But by the time the disease was notified, it spread to that sale yard, and it was on the way in the back of multiple sheep trucks across the country. And the same can be said for endemic diseases and pesty weeds. If you seek expert help for a challenging problem early, the less likely it is to cause a problem throughout your enterprise, and the cheaper and easier it will be to manage. So for animal disease, obviously a local vet, animal health officer or district vet is a good contact. And in South Australia at least, for weeds and pests, Natural Resources Office or NRM offices are a good contact point. So talked a bit about biosecurity. I'm sure you're all doing some biosecurity practices already. For example, I'm sure you all have sensors, but are they stock-proof? Do you vaccinate to prevent disease? Do you check your feed for weeds and restricted animal materials? Do you have a plan with your neighbours what to do when animals stray? Do you have a protocol for introducing new livestock onto your place? What about farm visitors and their vehicles and equipment? Are they clean? Which areas are they allowed to access? So just like a fire plan, a biosecurity gets all that out of your head and onto a piece of paper so it can be communicated to those who need to know. So it doesn't have to be war and peace, but it does have to be something that you've thought about where your risks are coming from. You've thought about, okay, how am I going to manage those? And then you've put down, even if it's just a two-pager, right, I'm going to have a plan for how I go about managing those risks. A biosecurity plan is basically the best defence you have against livestock pests, weeds and diseases. A biosecurity plan will reduce the risk of introduction, but also lead to quicker recovery and reduced losses should a disease event occur. And because it's working for you from the moment you implement it, the return is immediate, ongoing and cumulative. So when thinking about on-farm biosecurity planning, it's useful to think about breaking the job up into bite-sized chunks. I like to think of breaking your farm up into sort of commodities and think about the risks associated with each. And this grazing livestock production biosecurity manual was developed by the livestock industry, and it has a lot of information and some suggestions on how to sort of look at biosecurity planning in this way. I'll provide the link to that later in the presentation. The other way to think about farm biosecurity is to think about specific activities and what sort of risks each of these activities brings with it. So for example, what are you bringing onto your farm? What are you taking off your farm? What's happening on your farm? And how your farm interacts with the environment. So that's around weeds and pests mainly. In reality, the best approach is probably a combination of something like this and something like this, whatever works for you. So I just wanted to take a step back and just show you a little bit about cost effectiveness of biosecurity planning or biosecurity measures. This curve shows the economic return of various actions over time in the case of pest, disease or weed incursion. Basically what it's saying is that prevention has the highest economic return. So for every dollar you spend on prevention or biosecurity, the economic return is $100. Once the disease is present on farm, that's here, the economic return decreases to 25 to 1, and that's due to this cost associated with eradication. Once something's become established on your place, then you need to think about containment, and that's basically containing a problem to one part of your enterprise. And as you can see, rapidly the cost benefits of dealing with these issues decline quickly as you get to a point where the disease becomes entrenched on your place, or the weed problem becomes entrenched, and then you know, really you're fighting to get a return from implementing good sort of management procedures. So basically, biosecurity planning is about risk. So even with a good plan in place, and implemented, incursions still could occur. And so that's why having really good on-farm surveillance here and will assist with identifying incursions early. And then again, you're still at this very cost-effective point of being able to deal with any problems. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about record keeping. We're basically, we're all probably not as good at this as we should be. But it's, again, it's a really good way of recording what's happening on your farm, and when there's a problem, you can then look back through your records and say, okay, you know, what's happened in the last, you know, week, 2 weeks, you know, 5 weeks, 6 months. So depending on the type of problem you have, will depend on, you know, the sort of time frame that's relevant. So, for example, if you suddenly detect a lice problem, chances are it's not from the ram you bought in last week. It's probably likely to be 4 to 6 months ago that that problem was introduced. Basically, any activities you management activities with your animal movements are a really important one because they're reasonably high risk. Recording visitors and their activities. If you've got visitors coming on and off farm, maybe just like have a notebook or something where you record that. And obviously any sort of animal health issues or anything you notice on your plate. So, you know, some people like the old-fashioned pocket notebook, and that's still a very, very valid way of collecting information. But there's other electronic ways of doing that, and the Farm Biosecurity website also has templates that can be useful. So, basically, I just wanted to give you a very brief snapshot, firstly of sort of the big picture importance of on-farm biosecurity, in that it really does protect and manage our exposure to these trade-relevant diseases such as foot and mouth, but also that the same principles could be used to help you manage endemic disease on farm, which arguably is a much more important day-to-day risk for you in your enterprises. Biosecurity really, it is the responsibility of everyone from government at all levels, the national, state and local. It's the responsibility of the livestock industry, the supply chain and the public. But most importantly, it's your responsibility as a producer. And mostly that's because you've got the most to lose and the most to gain from good biosecurity practice. So better productivity, better reputation, preferential market access, and most importantly, better welfare for you and your animals. So think about biosecurity when you're doing the day-to-day farming activities, but also, you know, when you have visitors and when you're doing your budgeting and your maintenance, factor in that, you know, fencing maintenance or, you know, that wash-down bay. And also, it's really important because biosecurity is a shared responsibility to be talking to your neighbours about, you know, how you might work together to manage each other's biosecurity risks out. Remember that the difference between a small problem and a big problem is the time to detection and the speed of spread. And you can influence all of those areas collectively as an industry and individually as a producer who has influence on your own enterprise. At the end of the day, everyone just wants to see more happy, healthy and successful producers. And there's a few resources here. By no means is this extensive, but the Farm Biosecurity website is a really good sort of repository of information on, like really practical information on how you could implement farm biosecurity, or given that most of you are already doing something, is actually where you can look at supporting the work you're already doing with sort of additional biosecurity measures. The Paraboss website, FlyBoss, LiceBoss and Wormboss, have really practical and easy to follow sort of advice on those endemic disease issues. There's 3 programs run by MLA, Making More from Sheep, More Beef from Pastures and Going into Goats. And if you go into the MLA website or you search on a Google search, you'll find those resources online. And they're a really good starting point for discussion or with your local animal health expert. And lastly, don't forget your local Department of Primary Industries. So they've got great expertise, animal health officers, veterinary officers. Often they've got very good online resources, and you know that doesn't cost you anything, and it doesn't even cost you the time to make a phone call. So jump online and use some of these, you know, free resources available to you. And also, I'm Emma Rooke, and we're at Livestock Biosecurity Network. My phone number and my email are there. But also on the LBN website, my area of sort of influence is South Australia, but there's also offices in the other states. So if you go onto the LBN website, there'll be the contact details of those people. But feel free to call me wherever you're from. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. That's great. Okay, so just a reminder to everyone that if you did have any questions for Emma, if you could please type those questions into the questions panel of your webinar control panel there, and those will come through to me to ask of Emma. So we do have a few questions that have come through, Emma, if you're ready.
Sure, yep.
So one of the questions is, what should be the distance between quarantine sheds to normal farm sheds? So I think they're just sort of trying to clarify distance and so forth between, you know, areas that you might have, or animals you might have separated.
Okay, is this specifically about goats, or is this just a general question? You know,
I think it's a general question.
Just a general, yeah. So it depends on what you're trying to manage. So if it's a disease that spreads by contact, then it actually just some sort of physical separation would be enough. And of course, it's not just the physical separation of the sheds; it's the separation of sort of any equipment or clothing or anything that might be used between the sheds. So if you're dealing with something that's purely contact, then you know, any sort of distance over a sort of a couple of metres, I suppose, would be okay.
Yep.
Making sure that anything you took from either having the quarantine shed having its own gear, or if you need to use it across sheds, it needs to be properly cleaned, and the people working across the different sheds need to make sure that they are clean before they go into the non-quarantine shed. If it's something like a respiratory disease or something like that, so for example, an equine influenza, there's a even though it's outside sort of grazing livestock scope, it's a much further distance, because if you've got sneezing horses in one shed and healthy horses in the other, then you're going to have to actually physically separate those by a distance of say 50 metres or more. So it just depends a bit on what you're trying to manage. So just knowing what exactly you're trying to manage, and then learning about the disease and putting appropriate biosecurity measures in.
Excellent. Okay. The person just came back and clarified that the question was in relation to cattle, but I'm assuming your answer would still remain the same. Yeah,
I mean, with cattle, obviously there are some respiratory diseases which can be a concern, and sometimes those diseases actually aren't transmitted so much. They may be actually stress related. So, for example, in feedlots, respiratory diseases can be an issue. So again, making sure you have good biosecurity between the yards, and you know, probably a good. I haven't got the actual sort of scientific stats, but I'd imagine like a good distance, like 50 metres or more between pens would probably be useful from the point of view of reducing the spread of respiratory disease.
Yeah. Okay. We've just had a question come through. Does water quality come under the biosecurity scope, and if so, do you have any suggestions on tests or programs that may be suitable for this area?
Yeah, we don't really do too much in the water quality area. I have worked with water quality people in the past. Of course, their name escapes me at the moment, but it's probably Water can be a risk for biosecurity. So if you've got, for example, a lot of animals drinking at a water point, there can be some biosecurity risks. But as far as water quality goes, probably better to talk to someone who's expert in that area, and perhaps I could get back to that person with a contact, because I don't have one on me at the moment.
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, that's no problem. I'm sure we can find some information. That's no problem.
Yeah, we can find some.
So another question's come through. If you're using goats for vegetation management and you're containing them within an electric fence, how long after the area is clear can other stock return to the area, and how long should you keep the goats from your own stock when you return? Or would you suggest keeping goats used for vegetation management always separated from other stock? So I'm guessing that this might be in relation to internal parasites and that type of thing, and I'm assuming that that would be more of an issue if the other stock in question was sheep.
Yeah, I think probably your biggest risk would be internal parasites. And it depends a bit if those animals are part of your regular flock, or if you've just brought them in to use for vegetation, then you sent them out again, I suppose. Yeah, so it takes about 3 months for parasites to die on a paddock during sort of that hot weather. So, you know, when you're thinking about parasite control, which is probably your biggest biosecurity risk across species anyway, is that you're trying to think about which of your animals is most susceptible. So your young stock's going to be more susceptible than your older stock. So, for example, the risk of putting young animals on is probably higher after, you know, grazing goats than older animals. And also you want to think about the species. So, for example, you might be able to get away with grazing cattle over that before you graze a sheep over, and they can sort of mop up, or horses even. They can sort of break, if you like, put a break between the two, you know, the sheep and the goats, so that they're kind of acting as a vacuum to sort of vacuum up excessive sort of larvae on the paddock. So you can basically do it through resting paddocks for a period of probably 3 months. It probably will reduce most of your worm burden. You can use it by breaking the cycle through livestock, or you can use it by grazing the less susceptible. So say the adult sheep are less susceptible to getting sick from the worm burden than the younger sheep. So there's a few ways of doing it. The best, one of the best, I don't know if my screen's still up, but one of the best
yes, it is.
Yeah, resources is this WormBoss website, and it's actually a sheep website primarily, but it's got some really great resources on managing parasite control, and that would probably be the main one you'd be concerned about.
Yeah. So WormBoss is predominantly sheep focused. However, I should mention to the people listening in that we're currently in the process of working through a contract to expand WormBoss to include information specifically for goats as well, and that should be up and running in the next early next year, hopefully. So I just thought I'd throw that out there for interest to people. The same person's just come back in, Emma, just saying that, you know, would you change that approach at all if you were using tree fodder instead of regular pasture? I think that does make a bit of a difference, because obviously sheep are not necessarily browsing that tree fodder. Yeah,
so I mean, you know, as you know, that's one of the issues we have with running goats on our pastures, is that they tend to be browsers. So I suppose although your goat's going to tend to be browsing, they're still so if you're putting sheep on there after, they're more likely to pick up. You're still getting parasites put onto the pasture.
Yeah.
So if you've got a grazing animal coming in after, they're going to be picking up those parasites. But if you've got more goats coming in after, then because of their behaviour, you're more, I suppose, less likely to see a problem. But it's still helpful if you've got the ability to do it, to break that by using a different species, or at least resting a pasture for a period of time. But it really depends on your individual setup. And if you want, I'm happy to talk to that person if they want to provide their contact details for their specific situation.
Yeah, That's no problem. Okay.
We've
had a question come through. Oh, sorry.
Oh, maybe the going into goats module also might have something a bit more specific on goats and worm issues.
Yep, excellent. Yep, I'll certainly send those links around to everyone who's registered for the webinar. So we've had a question come through from another person just inquiring as to whether or not there are workshops run online, just going through the basic points of doing a biosecurity plan. So they're just wondering whether there's workshops available to do that, or whether that's something they can talk one-on-one with someone like yourself with, or whether that's something you would be able to run through quickly today.
Yeah, actually that's something, so we run a few workshops in Queensland, and although they've been reasonably successful, we're really looking at putting some webinars together for that purpose. So, so yes is the answer, but I'm not sure where they're at. So they'll be imminent, I suppose, is the question. And so I could provide maybe that to your group when it becomes available, or specifically to that individual. There are some resources available on the LBN website as well. So if you go to the lbn.org.au website and have a look around in there, there is some basic guidelines. But yes, there will be some webinars available on that. So maybe if I can find out where they're up to, or if there's any way we can get in touch with people when they're available, then yeah, I'd be very happy to pass that on.
Okay, great. And those would be webinars or physical workshops, were you meaning?
Well, it's depending on where you are, there's opportunity for both. So the webinars are definitely being developed, and if they want to pass on which state they're in, then their local LBN officer would be really happy to hear from them.
Okay, excellent.
Around that, yeah.
Cool. We just had another question come through. What's the normal time cattle should be quarantined for? Because this person's been told from different sources that it's either 21 days or 30 days.
Yeah. Again, it sort of depends what risk you're trying to manage. Probably one of the key risks, probably something I didn't mention, is the best way to manage risk is manage it before animals actually come onto farm. So just like Australia doesn't let product come into Australia unless they think it's already clean, if you like, the best way of managing risk is by actually getting things like cattle health statements that actually give you an idea of the disease status of the animals before they come onto farm. So things, if you're concerned about things like Johne's disease, then looking for animals in a MAP program, and if you're concerned about things like resistant worms, then you might want to think about you know, giving them a quarantine drench when they arrive on the property. Pestivirus is a little bit trickier because you can have animals that are persistently infected. It almost doesn't matter how long the quarantine period is. They can keep shedding over a number of months to years. So in that case, a quarantine period potentially wouldn't be that useful at all. So it's good to quarantine in general for a period of time, and it might depend on your ability to keep those animals separate, but we usually say about 3 to 4 weeks, so that you can get a sense that, you know, if there's if they've picked up anything in transit, or if something develops, you can pick it up before the animals end up in your whole herd. But there might be other specific diseases like Johne's or pestivirus that you need to think about in a more holistic way. So either I don't want to bring it, or reduce the risk of bringing it on through, you know, finding out about the MAP program, or with pestivirus you may want to think about testing, or at least understanding the risk of where the animals are coming from. So sorry that's a bit vague, but it's good practice to, you know, put animals aside for a period of time, and it really probably doesn't matter whether it's 21 days or 30 days. But if you're trying to manage something specific, then again, knowing about that disease and understanding what risks you're trying to manage are probably the best ways to go. But cattle health statements can be really useful because they kind of give you a visual checklist of the sorts of things you want to ask the vendor for before you purchase or bring animals on farm.
There's a sheep health statement that's available as well. Is there a similar thing for goats?
I think there is. It's just probably the best thing to go is to your local DPI and just ask them, one, what their requirements are, but also on this Farm Biosecurity website here. If you go, there's a list. If you go up to the top and there's something that says livestock and then there's a drop down and it's got all the species listed there. So if you go into goats, if there's an animal health statement for goats, it'll actually be on that page.
Okay, no worries. So we've got a couple of, if you need to provide any vaccinations for your cattle or any other species, I suppose, how long approximately would it take for that to be effective? I assume this varies depending on the vaccination and what you're vaccinating for.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of general rule of thumb that it takes animals about 10 to 14 days to actually mount an immune response to a vaccine. So probably a couple of weeks, after a couple of weeks, an animal should have some good immunity. But some vaccinations require a course, so it might be that they have one and then 4 to 6 weeks later they might have another one, and some will require annual boosters as well. So, but once they've had their first vaccination, you can start to think that they've got some reasonable immunity after about 14 days.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And we've just had a couple of our listeners type in saying, yes, there's definitely goat health statements available and you can access those through the Farm Biosecurity website. Thank you very much to those people who texted that in. So we've got time just for a couple more questions. So someone's just typed in just asking about ticks and requirements for managing ticks when you're transferring animals between different regions.
Okay, I'm going to have to be a little bit ignorant on this because we don't really have, well, okay, we don't have the tick fever ticks in South Australia, so I tend not to know too much about that. Yes, there are requirements, particularly around Queensland, Northern Territory, New South Wales, so, and there'll be requirements for coming into other states like South Australia and Victoria. The main concern is around the sort of you know, the sort of nasty cattle tick diseases that we tend to see, particularly up north, and that's, I suppose, why we don't tend to sort of, I don't tend to know as much about it as maybe my Queensland colleagues. There is another disease called tulariosis, which has emerged over the last 10 years, and that's also allegedly a tick-borne disease as well, although we have seen it on properties where people say they've never seen ticks before, so there's a suspicion about whether there might be other modes of transmission for ticks as well. If you're moving livestock from sort of tick fever areas into non-tick fever areas, there's going to be quite strict regulations around that. If you're moving animals within the sort of non-tick fever areas, you're probably not so much. So probably go into the DPI website, or if you're in Queensland or Northern New South Wales, yeah, have a speak to your local veterinary officer or animal health officer is probably the best thing, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. And are all the different Livestock Biosecurity Network events up on your website? Is there any sort of activities happening around Victoria? We've just had a question come in from one of the listeners.
Yeah, great. Yeah, probably if you go onto the LBN website, we do have, I think it's a news and events or a events calendar. Maybe it's on the right-hand menu. Excuse me. Go on there, and if there's events happening, they'll be on there. Alternatively, if you've got some specific suggestions for things that might interest you, give Pat a call, because Pat Kluwer is the local LBN officer in Victoria, and you can find his contact details on the LBN website. And yeah, he'd be more than happy to hear from you. One, to highlight any events coming, or to you know, to get your ideas on what you might find useful And I sort of encourage anyone to do that in any state they're in, because at the end of the day, we're actually working for you. We're industry funded, and we really appreciate feedback on what you might find useful, because otherwise we're kind of just guessing. So yeah, thanks.
No problem. Okay, well, I think we've just about exhausted all the questions. So thank you so much, Emma, for your time and for going through and answering all those questions. I should remind everyone that obviously when you are transferring animals between different properties or to the abattoir and so forth for slaughter, you obviously need to be aware and filling in your movement details for the NLIS database, because that is a critical part of our market access in being able to track back, you know, if there's a particular issue with a consignment or animal, being able to track that back to the property of origin. So that's really important. Now, Emma, I might just change it back to make myself the presenter again, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. If you've got any feedback or suggestions, please feel free to call me or email me. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Emma. And look, I will email around to everyone who's registered for the webinar today just some of the links to the information that we've spoken about, as well as Emma's contact information and a copy of her presentation. So don't stress too much if you've missed some notes or something like that. And before we go, I might just quickly run through some of our upcoming events that we have that people might be interested in. So we've certainly been talking a lot about diseases and so forth today, and things like sheep health statements and so forth. So I'd strongly recommend, there's a whole bunch of webinars that are being run over the next couple of weeks by leading sheep in Queensland. One of them is actually due to start at 1 PM Queensland time today, so in about 10 minutes. And they've run several other webinars in the last couple of weeks, which have all been recorded, and the most recent of which was talking through the importance of having a sheep health statement and how that can assist your business and knowing what sort of animals you're bringing onto the farm. So definitely pertinent to the discussion we've been having today. And if you want to register for any of those webinars that are coming up, just hop along to the Leading Sheep website, which is listed there on the screen. And you'll also find on that website all of the recordings from the previous ones as well. I should also mention that we have a predator control field day coming up in Charleville, Queensland on the 6th of August, which further details of that are also available on the Leading Sheep website. And I am aware that there's a bus that will be running from a few different places in New South Wales to that field day. If people are interested, the contact information there for the person organising that is on your screen, and once again I'll email this out to everyone who's registered. And the next webinar that we will be running is all around genetic improvement for your goat herd. So looking at how you can get the most bang for buck with your selection program. So we're just finalising some of the details for that, but it's likely to be on the 27th of August, and I will send around more information and registration details for that in the next week. I should also mention, as I said, on the Leading Sheep website, there's a whole bunch of different webinars that have been held recently that have been recorded there, and they're all free to watch and download. On our website, the MLA website, there's a whole bunch of different webinars around things such as parasite management, which again is quite relevant to the discussion we've had today. Looking at dog control, things like fencing and live exports. So again, they've all been recorded. They're available for anyone to download and watch at your leisure. I should mention that last week, the Pastoral Profit Program, which is all about providing resources and information to people in pastoral zones to help improve the profitability and sustainability of those businesses. This is an across-industry project as well, so relevant for people with sheep, cattle and goats. So they held a webinar last week, which is all around making sure your business is funding you for the future and is economically sustainable. So they really looked closely at whether or not you're putting enough money away to fund your own retirement, to fund the kids' education, and to plan your succession planning and so forth. So I know that might sound a little bit dull, but it's one of the best webinars I've ever sat through, and frankly, I thought it was a must-see. It was very, very, very salient, very interesting. So, and they really simplified it and made sort of took all the confusion out of it. So that one again has been recorded and is available from that Pastoral Profit website there. And just a final reminder that if you did want any further information and news about what's going on with the goat industry, you're welcome to subscribe to the Goats on the Move e-newsletter, which is free to subscribe to. That's the main communication channel that we use, and it's how we advertise things like the webinar that we've held today. There's also a whole bunch of free MLA market reports which you can access, which give you information about things like slaughter numbers, prices, all that type of thing. So both of those are free to access, and certainly the market reports are across species. So if you've got cattle or sheep as well, they're certainly relevant. But that's really all from me, and I just wanted to say thank you very much again to everyone for your time today and joining us, and thank you so much, Emma, for that fantastic presentation and going through and answering all those questions. I'm sure everyone found that very interesting, and yeah, thanks so much for your time, Emma.
Thank you very much.
That's okay. Well, what we might do is we'll wrap up the webinar now, and as I said, I'll email around all those links and information, and the recording will be up on the website in the next couple of days. Thanks very much, everyone, and hope you have a great day.